Hello, everyone. I'm Miss Gian, and today we will tackle chapter 4 of our social psychology course. And in this chapter, we will discuss behavior and attitudes, and these are the topics that we will uncover today. So, let me start with something that might surprise you. We've all been taught about that our attitudes determine our behavior. That's the narrative that's been introduced to us. Ang atong inner beliefs drive our outer actions, and that seems logical, right? And if you know someone's attitudes, you should be able to predict what they will do. Pero pag 1969, there's a researcher named Alan Wicker, and he dropped a bombshell on social psychology as a field. What he did, he reviewed dozens of studies looking at attitude behavior relationships and reached a shocking conclusion. What's a conclusion? People's expressed attitudes hardly predicted their varying behaviors. So I want you to think about this for a moment. So students who said na cheating was wrong, they still cheated on tests. The examples that I'll be giving is a result of various social science experiments. And people who expressed positive attitudes towards the church, they don't often show up and are not consistent in Sunday masses. And even racial attitudes, they don't predict discriminatory behavior very well. Ang pinaka-striking example that comes into mind is ang study sa moral hypocrisy. So, in this study, researchers asked people if it would be moral to assign themselves an easier task while giving someone else the harder one. And only 1 in 20 people said this would be moral. But when given the chance to actually make this assignment, 80% chose the easy task for themselves, even when they were told to flip a coin to make it fair. 90% still somehow ended up with a good task. So, this creates a puzzle that challenged everyone, challenged psychologists even. Okay? So, if attitudes don't predict behavior, unsa di makapredict? So, before we come into conclusion na, okay, behavior predicts attitude or whatnot. Attitude that precedes behavior is not that dependable. Well, there are conditions wherein attitudes do predict behavior. Pero kuan, di ba? Na specific conditions. Ang major problem ang good is social desirability. We don't wanna appear, of course, we don't wanna appear racist in front of everyone. Even if, for example, I really believe some racist beliefs or ideology, right? We don't want to appear like that in front of everyone. That's socially sanctioned behavior. So often, my expressed attitudes are those that I think others want to hear rather than what I truly believe. So, if you don't know this, US legislators who voted for the Iraq War had private reservations. And this is an example where social pressure is affected by what one says publicly. So mo na siyang there are researchers that develop ways to measure implicit attitudes. The implicit attitudes are the unconscious biases we're not even aware of. Ang tawag sa test is the IAT, although this test has a criticism of its own. Ang IAT has been taken by over 5 million people online since 1998, and it reveals that about 80% of people show implicit bias against elderly people, even if they consciously believe they're not ageist. And what's striking kay kaning implicit attitudes often predict behavior better than what people consciously say, especially for attitudes formed early in life, katong about race and gender when you're raised to when you grew up and led to believe that they're led to believe an aspect or ideology about race or gender. And they also predict hiring decisions, mga relationship outcomes, and even suicide attempts. So many siya. Go back to chapter 3. We discussed this one already. This is the dual processing system involving explicit attitudes, those that are attitudes that I express freely, I'm conscious about, and implicit attitudes, those attitudes that I'm not conscious about. I'm unconscious about this. It's automatic and effortless. They operate below the radar of consciousness. Pero they still influence behavior. And ang IAT, they try to investigate or uncover the implicit attitudes that we all have. Ang key insight ani class is that both systems contribute to behavior and sometimes they're pointing in different directions. Now, here's another key to understanding when attitudes predict behavior. You can't judge based on single instances. It's like trying to predict manggod, say, a basketball player's skill from one shoots a ball versus looking at the average shooting score or points over the whole season's a game. So, individual behaviors are influenced by so many factors like the weather, your mood, social pressure, how tired you are, what happened earlier that day, Okay? Pero when you look at patterns of behavior over time, attitudes become much better at predicting the behavior. So for example, katong religious example, right? Your religious attitude, it might not predict whether you go to church in a specific Sunday. Pero it can predict the total amount of religious behaviors that you engage over, say, a month or a year. And this is what we call the aggregation principle. And it works across all kinds of domains like health behaviors, relationships, consumer choices. Ang research, they consistently show stronger attitude behavior correlations kung imong i-aggregate ang behaviors rather than just looking at it isolated or in isolated acts. So, unsa may mga examples of aggregating behavior? For example, kanang atong smartphones, they track our sleeping pattern. They track our screen time use. Mo na siya ang examples of aggregating our behavior. Atong social media activity, it also serves as a form of aggregated behavior. Ang lesson is, if you want to understand someone's attitude, we should not judge them but what they do in one occasion. You need to look at the pattern. Another crucial factor or condition is the specificity of the attitude. Okay, they matter very much. Ang general attitudes, when we're talking about specificity, we're talking about the research domain na. When you're trying to measure something, see the relationship or if the relationship is significant. Okay, if you want to measure a variable na general siya, it will be very terrible in predicting a specific behavior. But if your attitude is specific and important to the behavior of interest, then it is a good predictor. And this isn't just a small effect. Kay si Fishbein and Asgen, they found that 26 out of 27 studies using general attitudes failed to predict behavior, while all 26 studies using specific attitudes successfully predicted behavior. So for example, class, having a general attitude sa Asians won't predict whether you'll help a specific Asian person who needs. Pero ang attitudes about helping behavior will predict helping. Another example, general health and fitness attitudes, it won't predict whether you'll jog tomorrow. Pero your specific attitude about the benefits of jogging and the costs of jogging will predict your jogging frequency. So this led to the development of the theory of planned behavior. This is a very famous research or theory sa social psych and been used to a lot of studies already uh, in the social, the research domain, even in IO psychology. So, kani siya na theory, it has been tested in over 700 studies with 276,000 participants. And it shows behavior comes from three things. First is your attitude toward the specific behavior. And then what you think others expect you to do, that's the subjective norm. And whether you believe you can actually do it, that's your efficacy, whether or not you can do it easily. And interestingly, just asking people about their intentions increases the likelihood that they'll follow through. And so there's something about articulating our plans that make us more likely to act on them. But there's a caveat always because it's not, here in social psych and maybe most and if not all psychology concepts, we don't do absolutist conclusions, right? Like kanang this is what will really happen. If A happens, then B happens, right? We don't do that. We always use likely to more often, sometimes, because again, there are a lot of a lot of other variables that come into play when it is happening in the real world. So going back, diba, there's sometimes when we articulate our plans, it makes us more likely to act on them. That's not my case. Kay, there is a study that's found that when you actually voice out your goals to someone, for some people, there's a feeling I've already accomplished the goal. So I tend to not follow through. Kay, I got the validation that I have already. I'll give an example. When I told them told my family, I'm gonna run tomorrow 21 km. And every time I notice this ako self. Every time I say it to someone, I don't follow through. And that's my case because I receive a validation from them. Their reaction, their surprised look, their proud look for some, right? For wow, like that. So, well, I got the extrinsic reward that I want from telling someone of my goal, then I don't follow through na. So remember, always good ka mo think through na nuanced good ang concepts na discuss here. In some instance, and there is a general trend to some concepts sa social psych, pero it will always not be consistent na A is going to when A happens, then B happens. Okay, I hope that's clear. And the third condition is for attitude to more likely predict behavior is when attitudes are powerful. Much of our behavior class is mindless. We act out of habit without really thinking. Example, we say hi in hallways, we say good morning without thinking about it. When someone asks, how are you? We say fine. When, it's more complex, our feelings are more complex than four letters, Fine, fine. And these are automatic behaviors. Our conscious attitudes rarely get activated, but there are ways to make attitudes more powerful and influential. The first one is bringing it to mind. So there's a research finding about this. When students were reminded of their attitudes right before jury duty, they showed much stronger attitude behavior consistency. And also, self awareness is found to increase this consistency too. So, in one very striking study, 71% of students cheated when they were alone. Pero when they were placed in a room with a mirror, only 7% cheated. The mirror made them more self aware and more likely to act consistently with their values. Another ways or another way wherein our attitude becomes powerful or strong and influential is when the attitudes develop because of a direct experience. So if when you experience something and because of that experience you developed a certain attitude, then it's more stronger and more likely to predict or good predictor of your behavior. So for example, university students who actually experience housing shortages, they're more likely to take action than those who just heard about the problem. People who were suffering because of the flood were maybe have the strongest attitude towards rallying on the streets, fighting for their rights, for something to change, para no more na anti-corruption rally, something like that, right? For example, white people that encountered an isolated case of aggressive behavior and that person is black, so they would develop a stronger attitude against segregation policies. I know I don't have right to comment on American politics, but polarization is widely happening over there. Right? Also here in the Philippines, and social media has a great influence on that. Anyway, you get the point, right? When it's brought to mind and when it is developed through direct experience, our attitudes become more powerful and influential, and thus this makes it more better at predicting certain behavior. So let's move to the second topic, which is when behavior also influences attitude. So we have a very interesting study that almost every psychologist or psychology student knows about, and this is the Zimbardo Stanford Prison Experiment. So, what this experiment is, a short overview is that college students were randomly assigned to play guards or prisoners in a mock prison. And what started as role playing quickly became reality. The guards there in the study became cruel, and the prisoners became passive or rebellious. And Zimbardo described a growing confusion between reality and illusion, and between role playing and self identity. The study had to be stopped after just 6 days instead of the planned 2 weeks. And this experiment and how researchers theorized what happened has drawn a lot of audience class and also critiques. I won't share what I think about the experiment and the theories that I formed on my own because the results are more nuanced than what one researcher or scholar says. After all, diba, we talked about this already. Na behavior could not be simplified. Na A causes B. There will always be a lot of factors involved. So rather, I encourage you to research further if you are curious about this experiment and Dr. Zimbardo's propositions and arguments. So remember from chapter 3 about belief perseverance, okay, na you should be, and we all should be open to other possible explanations and theories so as not to be rigid in our thinking. Anyway, the reason why I brought up this experiment is to emphasize how roles shape attitudes, not just reflect them. What starts as acting can become real, and this happens in everyday life. See, Frederick Douglass wrote about how slave ownership transformed previously kind people. And example, sa inyo, new career roles, they also change us. Sa military, it's also observed because there's military training. And then professional identities also develop over time. And we see this in modern context. Pod, method acting can change some of the actors' personalities. Therapeutic role playing is used in treatment, and our online personas can affect our offline identities. Institutional roles can sometimes corrupt otherwise compassionate people, though it's important to note that individuals vary. Not everyone becomes a bad apple when placed inside a barrel of rotten apples. Okay, this was been the contention for so long. Ni Zimbardo, no? The situation makes people evil. Pero there are a lot of critiques coming from the study, they found a lot of fault in the way it's designed, okay, the way it's simulated, ang prison and the assignment of roles. You go research that, there's a lot of detailing that. But let's go back to our point. Personality traits and other influences always come into play. Pero at present, we know and understand na we don't just choose roles that fit our personalities. The roles that we play also shape our personalities. So, yeah, that's one thing. And another way behavior influences attitudes is that when we say out loud things, it can change what we actually believe. Because people naturally adjust their messages, right, to please their listeners. But then something interesting happens. People begin believing their adjusted messages. And the key condition here is that they must not feel heavily bribed or coerced to say it. Ang mechanism here is that we internalize what we say when we feel responsible for saying it. And external pressure reduces this effect, but when we feel like we chose to say something, we tend to believe it. And this has real world applications everywhere. So on sales training, it changes salespeople's attitudes about their products. On political campaign workers, they become more committed to candidates they promote. Even therapeutic exercises where people argue against their own problems can change their perspectives. So let's now proceed to the foot in the door phenomenon. I've been saying about this for since chapter one because I'm so fascinated by this phenomenon. And it's a powerful technique that's been used any domains, yeah, but most likely in sales. So it works like this. If people comply with a small request, they become more likely to comply with a larger related request later. In this classic study, um, only 17% of homeowners agreed to install large quote and unquote drive carefully signs in their yards, but 76% agreed to the large signs after accepting small window signs. And the small initial commitment changed how they saw themselves. And this has been replicated many times. Sample cancer charity donations increased from 46% to 92% with a prior small request. Blood drive attendance went from 62% to 81% when people first made a small commitment. The drill. The key requirements are that the initial compliance must be voluntary, and the person must perceive choice in their decision. It creates self perception of being a helpful person or whatever trait is relevant. And then momentum builds from there. So remember to tie everything. Attitude predict behavior, but behavior can also shape attitude. Everything is bidirectional, and behavior affects cognition, and the way we think also affects our behavior. And our attitude affects the way we think, and the way we think also affect our attitude, our cognition, right? So everything. So remember this diagram. This just pertains to the constructs here have a bidirectional influence or are influencing each other. So there is a significant real world example or applications of these principles that we just discussed, and it is racial integration. So in 1954, social scientists testified to the Supreme Court with a bold hypothesis na if we legislate moral action, we can indirectly affect heartfelt attitudes. And this contention was counter to the common assumption na you can't legislate morality. Pero the evidence suggests the social scientists were right. Kaya when this law was passed on, American attitudes towards school integration jumped dramatically after the 1954 Brown v. Board decision. And then between 1964 and 1974, there was a 20% decrease in all white neighborhoods, friends, and coworkers. Attitude changes parallel these behavior changes, like support for blacks living anywhere. They chose rows blacks living anywhere. They choose rows from 65% to 87%. So this demonstrates how legal and institutional changes can drive individual attitude change, though it's important to note that the benefits require proper conditions and that structural inequalities persisted despite attitude improvements. The broader principle is that contact theory works. So interaction reduces prejudice under the right conditions, and institutional change can drive individual psychological change. And kaninang mga principles, they also operate at the mass level too. So the public behaviors, they can create widespread attitude change through social psychological mechanisms. In Nazi public behaviors like Nazi salutes, rallies, and flag displays helped create attitude change, and the Hail Hitler greeting created psychological discomfort for doubters who had to say it repeatedly. And as one observer noted, prevented from saying what they believed, they tried to establish psychic equilibrium by making themselves believe what they said. And we also have political rituals, right? It exists everywhere. Daily flag salutes in schools, national anthems at events, pledges of allegiance. This creates psychological pressure for attitude alignment and behavior. Another example, brainwashing sa prisoners of war during the Korean War wasn't irresistible thought control, but a systematic process using the same principles we've discussed. So it started with trivial requests and built to significant ones, and it required active participation. Writing, speaking, group discussions, and this year used the foot in the door technique. It started small, then little by little build up. The result was that many cooperated and some even chose to stay in communist countries after the war. And it's not magic, it was the systemic application of social influence principles. And we see similar techniques in terrorists and cult recruitment, corporate culture development, political campaigns, social media engagement patterns today. So, why does behavior influence attitude? There are three main theories that compete to explain this phenomenon. We have the self presentation theory, the cognitive dissonance theory, and the self perception theory. So, on sending self presentation theory, it says we express attitudes to appear consistent to others, and it's in simpler words, it's strategic impression management. Okay, we're motivated by the desire to look good socially. A limitation anina theory is that well, people still change attitudes even when the behavior is completely private or even when they don't know the person. So, how can they want to look good in front of somebody? Then, so cognitive dissonance theory, and third, it was developed by Lee and Festinger, and it says that inconsistent cognitions create uncomfortable psychological tension, and we change attitudes to reduce this discomfort. And ang focus ani na theory is internal psychological processes, and it requires awareness of the inconsistency. Now, the third one is the self-perception theory. It's developed by Daryl Bam. And it says we infer our attitudes by observing our own behavior, just like external behaviors making attributions about us. There's no uncomfortable tension that's required. It applies when our attitudes are weak or ambiguous. Kaning tuluka theory, they make different predictions and applies to different situations. And you know, sometimes having a lot of theories, you would say, okay, libog, I don't know, ambiguous, abstract concepts, I hate it. But class, having competing theories isn't a weakness of science, it's a strength. Different theories drive research and discovery, and multiple explanations can lead to the same predictions, which strengthens our confidence in the basic principles. So, think about the specific or the scientific process here. So when we have different theories that can explain the same phenomenon, it forces us to design better experiments to test which explanation is correct. And often we discover that each theory captures part of the truth, at least, diba? So the more the theory the more nuanced a construct is, the more we understand. And maybe the more questions we ask. And the more questions we ask, the more we try to uncover the answers. Then the know, and then the more we know, the more questions. It's a cycle. Anyway, let's dive deeper sa cognitive dissonance theory. So, unsa ning cognitive dissonance theory? Unsa yung core idea? Ang core idea ni theory is that inconsistent beliefs create psychological tension called dissonance. And ang kaning dissonance, it's uncomfortable and motivating. So, why motivating? Because once we experience this discomfort, na inconsistent atong beliefs sa ato ang actions, we want to reduce this tension by changing our cognitions, especially our attitudes. And one way people reduce dissonance is through selective exposure. Unsa ning selective exposure? Preferring information that confirms our attitudes over challenging information. Asa ninyo ma-observe? Social media. If you mute or unfollow people with dissenting views ninyo, if you follow pages of your favorite politicians, that's one thing. So what is the difference that I miss of confirmation bias and selective, what was the word again? selective exposure. The cognitive bias is in the word. Cognitive siya na process, right? So we tend to recall information that's aligned with our self-concept, that's aligned with our beliefs. We also tend to just be able to read information, diba? Dagan kayo information na musud sa ato ang senses. So we only see and read information that aligns with our self-concept. Dili siya contradicting view. That's a cognitive na aspect. Pero the selective exposure, behavioral siya. You do the action because you don't, or it's uncomfortable for you to listen to another point of view or a dissenting view or contradicting belief nimo. So, pero it follows, cognitive bias also follows selective exposure, of course. You have cognitive bias, so you tend to click on the pages and follow the politicians that are your favorite or those that is in line with your views. So, muna siya ang example of how people use or do selective exposure. So, people seek attitude consistent information about 2 to 1 over information that challenges their views. Muna siya example. So, after making difficult decisions, we experience post-decision dissonance, but we reduce this by upgrading the chosen option and downgrading the rejected one. It's funny, Kai. The grass doesn't grow greener on the other side. We make it less green in our minds. And also, this happens even in 4-year-olds and capuchin monkeys. It's all of these examples shows how fundamental this process is. And the most famous finding ani is insufficient justification. So kaning study ni Festinger and Crossmitz, they paid people $1 to lie about a boring task. And when they paid these people, they showed more attitude change than the comparison group, which was paid $20. So it seems backwards until you understand the logic na the less external justification, the more there is internal justification needed. So example, if I'm paid $20 to say something I don't believe, I can easily explain my behavior. Well, I did it for the reward. I was paid $20. That's a big sum of money. Pero if I'm only paid $1, I need another explanation. And I might convince myself na I actually believe what I said. The $1 is not sufficient per se. Okay, so that's a study that uncovers cognitive dissonance. So let's now move to the second one. I didn't discuss self-presentation theory because it's very understandable naman. So we'll just touch on the two theories, the cognitive dissonance and this one's the next, the self-perception theory. And it offers a different explanation that doesn't really require, uncover, or get the variable of uncomfortable tension na cognitive dissonance theory proposes. Ang kaning self-perception theory, ang iyang proposition is that we simply infer our attitudes from observing our behavior, the same way that we judge others' attitudes. And this connects to some fascinating research on embodied emotion. Going back to William James, ang idea is that we infer emotions from bodily responses, like we see a bear, experience physical arousal, then experience fear. And modern research confirms these emotion behavior connections. Facial feedback effects show that frowning makes people feel angrier, while smiling makes people feel happier and find cartoons funnier. And research puts people na magdo Botox class, then Botox is paralyzing frowning muscles and they reduce people's ability to process negative emotions. Even simple things like nodding versus shaking your head affects how much you agree with messages you're hearing. And body posture effects are striking too. Sitting up straight makes people more confident in their ideas. High power poses increase testosterone and risk-taking behavior. And how you walk affects your mood. Shuffling versus striding, even folding your arms increases persistence on difficult tasks. So, these effects suggest na our physical state directly influence our mental state, which supports the self-perception explanation. So, you might ask na when does each theory is best applied? Ang self-presentation theory, it works best in public situations where impression management matters and people want to appear consistent. Ang limitation ani is that it doesn't explain private attitude change. Ang cognitive dissonance theory, it is applied when behavior contradicts clear, important attitudes. It requires awareness of inconsistency and feeling of choice and creates measurable physiological arousal. And ang best ani is it's best when it explains attitude change over counter-attitudinal behavior. Okay, so where there is difference sa ako ang beliefs and sa akong action. And then the self-perception theory, it works when attitudes are weak, ambiguous, or unclear. So there's no contradiction that's needed or arousal that's required. It just explains attitude formation rather than attitude change and better explains over justification effects. The beauty of science is that these theories can be integrated rather than competing. They don't compete each other. It's best if you integrate them. Different theories explain different aspects of the phenomenon. So dissonance explains attitude change when you're contradicting strong attitudes, and self-perception explains attitude formation when attitudes are weak. So both processes can operate simultaneously. And having multiple explanations actually increases our confidence in the basic principle that attitudes follow behavior. It's like having different roads that all lead to the same destination. Ang principle rests on multiple theoretical foundations, and this is how science progresses. Competing theories force us to design better studies, discover boundary conditions, and develop more nuanced understanding. So next, we'll look into how all these knowledge are applied, or what are the practical applications and implications. And they're very extensive and powerful. So for behavior change, start with small voluntary commitments using the foot in the door technique. Make people self-aware during important decisions. Focus on specific rather than general attitudes and help people experience rather than just hear about issues. In education, active learning is more effective than passive listening. Student teaching changes attitudes towards subject matter, and service learning connects classroom to real-world experience. And lastly, debate participation affects political attitudes. So therapy, behavioral interventions can change self-concept. And role-playing in therapy also works. Graduated exposure therapy helps people overcome fears, acting as if until it becomes real is a valid therapeutic approach. And for social change, policy changes can drive attitude changes as we saw with integration, and public commitment increases private belief. Ritual and ceremony create shared meaning. And for personal development, fake it till you make it has psychological validity. So if you want to be more confident, you act confidently. You want to be more caring? Perform caring behaviors. Identity follows behavior and not just vice versa. And with this knowledge, class, of course, it comes with a responsibility. Understanding that these variables, these influence techniques means we need to recognize when others are using them on us and use them ethically ourselves. So we don't use this to manipulate people, okay? So we do this for mutual benefit, not exploitation. And I want to stress that out, okay? Use it ethically. So we've taken quite a journey today, and we started with the assumption that attitudes determine behavior and discovered the reality is much more complex and interesting. Attitudes and behavior influence each other bidirectionally. Remember the diagram, the triangle, okay? Behavior's influence on attitudes depends on specific conditions. So when social influences are minimal, when attitudes are specific rather than general, and when attitudes are accessible and based on experience. We've also seen how multiple psychological processes explain these relationships. Self-presentation, cognitive dissonance, and self-perception theories each contribute unique insights. They don't compete with each other. And we've explored practical applications in behavior change, education, therapy, and social change. And the key insight is that we are not just passive recipients of our attitudes. We're also not just passive recipients of environmental stimuli like a robot, right? We're not so mechanistic as hardcore behaviorists propose. We actively construct our sense of self through our actions. And what we do shapes who we become as much as who we are shapes what we do. And this knowledge is empowering, but it also comes with responsibility. Okay? Understanding how behavior shapes attitudes can help us become the people we want to be and create the social changes we believe in. But we must use these principles ethically with respect for human dignity and autonomy. Okay, I want to be very clear on this one. Ang relationship between behavior and attitudes will continue evolving as technology changes how we interact and express ourselves. Social media, virtual reality, artificial intelligence, all will create new context for these age old psychological principles. So it's not just, we don't stop here. There are probably a lot of variables na wala na uncovered that will be uncovered in modern social psych. What we know now is what we might be different tomorrow. Ang journey from assumption to understanding, from laboratory findings to real-world applications, shows how psychology can help us better understand ourselves and create positive change in the world. So, as to close this chapter, because one of the most striking for me, wow, murag Dora the Explorer, no? But what's one of the most striking information for you? For me, katong kuan. Mura na jud Dora. Katong Zimbardo. Because when it was introduced to me when I was an undergraduate, when I was a college student, it was introduced differently. It was taught differently. But now, there are a lot of critiques, a lot of researchers that uncovered what was proposed or the argument here might not be as straight cut as it is. Diba? So that's how science is. Well, again, it's best Jude to be not rigid in one's thinking, to be open to other possible theories and explanations, so as to for us to accept new information when it comes. And that ends here. I hope you guys learned something. Thank you very much for listening, and as always, have fun learning.